what's called overstaying your welcome. So this is a case when managers really want to stay in a job, and they don't, even if they're not the right person to do it anymore. So this is a big problem that happens in startup companies. So often someone like Mark Zuckerberg will say, I want to be running Facebook. Now Mark Zuckerberg was not really a businessman, he was really a technology guy, but he wants to be running Facebook. And so they have to bring in all these people to like control him and make sure he doesn't destroy the company basically, because he really shouldn't be running it in the first place, right? And so one thing that managers will often do is they'll try to make themselves invaluable by getting involved in a lot of really complicated stuff that no one other than them understands, and so it becomes impossible to fire them because it'll all blow up if they're not around. And Andrew Stevenson? Oh, he's not here today. Okay. Well, we should probably move on anyways. So, work really differently for all of these different things. So the right way to give incentives is really you have to balance which of these problems are most important in any given situation, and which help do these best. So when companies are financed, many of these issues arise. And in fact, the problems that I gave you is going to ask you to think about these things. But let's just quickly think about some of the possibilities. So one type of financing that a company can have is personal capital. This is just someone puts in their own money. Then you have the advantage that, basically everything works then, right, for the reasons we talked about earlier. But another type of financing is you can get money from friends and family. And this is what companies do at an early stage often. They get loans from their, or investments from their friends and their family. And the advantages of these are somewhat similar to putting your own money in. So you really care about your friends and family. You don't want to disappoint them. But on the other hand, your friends and family don't have that much money themselves, right? And so it's hard to start a big company that way. So the next stage you usually go to is venture capital. You try to get money from a company which is dedicated to giving money to startups like yours, and therefore usually has quite a bit of expertise in your area and can understand what your business is doing, and therefore might be able to do a better job of monitoring it. And they often end up replacing the manager. And again, some of the advantages of this are because they understand your company, they can probably monitor you better. You can also probably establish a personal relationship with them, which will lead you to be more intrinsically motivated. But the downside of it is that, again, the private equity probably doesn't have that much money relative to what a public market would, or what a bank might have. And so those offer ways to access more money. One of the ways to access the most money is through public bonds. One problem with public bonds relative to bank loans is that imagine that you start going into bankruptcy. If there's a zillion different people that own your bonds, it's going to be very hard for them to negotiate with you to keep you from going into bankruptcy. Whereas if you have a bank, the bank can keep you from going into bankruptcy by trying to readjust your loan. This was a big problem that arose during the subprime crisis, right? Which was that a bunch of banks owned the loans of all these people who had their mortgages, right? And even though it would have been in the interest of all those people to negotiate with them, it was too hard to get all these people who owned the loans that had been sold off to negotiate with people to change their home loans. Okay, so given all these problems that show up within organizations, within firms, why should we have companies at all? So, I'm short on time, so I'm gonna sort of power through this. So, if you think about a GM assembly plant, right? They really don't need to own the assembly plant. For example, what they could do is they could hire one company to put the tires on the car. They could hire another company to paint the car. They could hire another company, to attach the bolts. And all these things could be, independent other companies that are doing everything to the car. Now, this might seem a bit unrealistic, but if you just think about, I forget what the Reynolds Club. You think about the Reynolds Club, right? There's like 1,000 different companies in there, and they're all exterior to the university. But you sort of wouldn't know. They're all offering different bits of food service. So it's not necessarily obvious that you can't subcontract all these different processes, right? And in fact, this is happening for increasing things. So many places outsource their tech support, or their IT services, or all sorts of different things. So a natural question is, wouldn't it be just more efficient to ship everything outside of the company and buy it from someone else? And the Coase article that I had you read pointed out that within firms, things are much more like command and control. They're like a top-down, someone tells someone to do something, and so forth. And if economists, as you probably have already picked up, tend to believe not in command and control, not in centralized control, but rather in the market system, why don't we just operate everything like that within companies? And these types of questions are usually called the boundaries of the firm, and during the rest of the lecture, I'm going to try to quickly explore some of these questions. So, Coase was sort of the first person to offer a theory of the firm. And basically what he said is that there were some costs of using the market, and there were some costs of using things within a company. And that firms chose their size based on the relative costs of doing things within the company and outside the company. So costs outside the company come from having to negotiate all the terms of contracts, having to enforce the contracts, having to figure out what the prices are, some tax reasons, and so forth. And some of the managerial costs of the firm include that you have to manage all these people, all the principal agent problems that I was talking about. The head manager of the company may only have the capacity to manage so many people, right? And so he may get overwhelmed. Now, a big problem with Coase's article, as some of you might have picked up, is that it's a little bit hard to even figure out exactly what he's trying to argue, right? Because he's very, very vague. And if you found it hard to understand what he did, don't feel bad, because economists for 100 years, basically, have found it really hard to understand what he was trying to say exactly. And later theories have tried to clarify these things, and I don't know exactly how successfully, so let's go through some of them and see what you think. So one theory is Williamson's theory of a firm. And this emphasized three factors that made integration attractive. So the first one was frequency. If I'm constantly buying things from you, right, then there's going to be a lot of times that I'm going to have to negotiate terms with you. And that might be really cumbersome. And so I want to actually hire you if I'm using you very often. Right? Second factor was uncertainty. If it's unclear what I'm going to ask you to do for me at this point, it might not make very much sense for us to write down a contract which says exactly what you're going to do for me, because I don't even know what it is at this point. It's better for me to hire you and then just ask you to do what you want later. So a famous example of this was a story that Sandy Grossman, who got his PhD here at Chicago, used to tell, which is that he was having his house built, and he wanted to make sure he didn't get ripped off. So he wrote this like 100-page contract saying, if this happens to the house, you have to pay me this much. If this happens to the house, you have to pay me this much, etc. Then eventually, the house did turn out to have a problem, and it wasn't one of the ones that he listed in the list. And so he went to a judge saying, this guy screwed up my house, won't you help me? And he said, well, you didn't write it down on the list. Usually I would have helped you out, right? But you didn't write it down on the list of the things in the contract, and so clearly you didn't care about it, so I can't help you. When there's uncertainty, it often makes sense to have these more open-ended employment relationships rather than these contracts. There's also this issue of asset specificity, which I'm just going to skip, actually. Okay, so Grossman and Hart, on the other hand, emphasize a different factor that I think can be seen most clearly by thinking about why Google recently decided to build its own social network rather than just linking into Facebook more heavily, right? So why couldn't Google have just said, look, Facebook's better than any social network we're going to make. Why don't we just make Gmail integrate really well with it, and make Google Contacts integrate really well with it, and all that sort of stuff. And I think the problem was that Google really wanted these integrated services to all work really well together, connect up well between all the different things. And the problem is, imagine that Google had made a huge investment in making everything link up really well with Facebook. The problem that it would face at that point is that Facebook could then say, oh, you really want to link up with us? Let's charge you $1 billion, dollars, right? For the right. Given that you've already made this huge investment in linking up with us, you better pay us for all the benefits you're going to get, right? And knowing that, Google doesn't want to make the investment.